So it didn't take me long to say something controversial on the channel, which got me at least half a dozen messages of people saying my advice was inconsistent or contradictory. And I thought it was an interesting enough topic to make another video on, especially in a short response period. So without further ado, the comment that I made in my previous video about 11 tips on how to improve your play, the number 2 tip I had was dropping for the first turn is almost never worth it. And because I was creating a fairly short video format where I just kind of covered each point in a couple of minutes, I think the context of this statement relative to the other suggestions I made, specifically around playing aggressively and creating board space, did in fact end up being quite contradictory. And I even thought of this just after I published the video. Obviously, it's too late to re-record it by that point, and I guess I'm glad people are watching enough to pay attention to what I'm saying. But I wanted to delve into this a little bit more, and I do actually agree with you that in the context of the last video, my statement was inaccurate and contradictory. But I want to explain a little bit more why I made that statement. So the main reason I put that in there as a point on how to improve your play by avoiding dropping for the first turn is I see a lot of people just do it out of habit, or I don't want to say instinct, because instinct I believe to be generally something good, but just they drop for first because they just believe it's better to go first without really quantifying why. What are they getting out of it? So that's what this video is going to be about, is just exploring what are the telltale signs that you should look for to understand whether or not you should go for it. Because but I'm basically a hypocrite, because in my last video I talked about don't drop for first turn, it's not a good idea. But if you rewind 2 videos previous to that, you'll actually see a tournament battle report where I dropped for first turn in 2 out of 5 games, I think. So I'm going to cover those actually in this video, just as a good case study. So that's the summary for me, is people just drop for first turn without thinking why are they doing it, just because, quote unquote, it's good. So before we delve into the telltale signs of why and when you should drop, let's examine what are the differences between playing first and second. This is kind of the fundamentals of it all, of the theory. So obviously, when you go first, you know that your troops are going to be 100% intact because your opponent hasn't had a turn yet, and you kind of know what you've got. Like you've still got your entire army. You know that everything's going to be there. You're going to be able to move it, cast with it, shoot with it, etc. So it's that peace of mind and security in knowing that you're at full operational capacity still. You can damage the enemy. This is obviously the flip side of the coin, where you can actually damage the enemy before they move. So they've got a little bit of an unknown. Am I going to lose a fast cavalry unit? Am I going to get my wizard or monster killed? Is there going to be stuff pressuring me all over the board? You're going to be able to gain board space because you're going to be able to create a little bit of breathing room behind you by going up, by pushing. And the con that I've got here is that you won't get the last turn, so you don't get a chance to rally your units at the end of the game. Now, conversely, going second, and there's an asterisk here, which for the purposes of this video, going second also refers to deploying second. If you're one of those rare people out there that has the guts to deploy your whole army and declare that you're going second, I salute you, sir. I wish I had your cojones, frankly. I do see this sometimes, and when it works, it's amazing. I know that this was something that one of my brain trusts and I talked about a few years ago, was the benefits of going second. But I just don't see it being nearly as easy to realize the benefits of putting all your stuff out and declaring that you can go second versus putting all your stuff out and saying you're going to go first. Normally, my preference is to let the opponent start to deploy and hope that they drop it all for first, because that way I get to see their whole army counter deploy perfectly and get the second turn, which is often my preference anyway. So Just going through these bullets, you can flee in turn 6 and still rally. You can charge, move, magic, and shoot without consequences in turn 6. Which can also be the difference between winning and losing an objective, because you can just blast the opponent's unit off it or finish off some survivors for a few extra battle points. You can move on to objectives unopposed, and you can see where. So this comment here, you can see where the opponent's stuff is. This is to do with deploying second. This is about reacting. And in my last video, I talked about rock, paper, scissors, also known as paper, scissors, rock. Effect where you're trying to engineer favorable unit matchup. So this for me is a very big advantage of deploying second. Now the big downside, and this is one I actually struggle with a lot when my opponent drops for first, is it's usually harder to get to the objectives because the opponent has a head start. Hold ground is a perfect example where they can just shove a huge amount of powerful units up the center. I think what's the three? Always forget the name of this one. I want to say loot counters, but it's not loot counters. It's the 3 pennies mission. Look it up. It's the 3 pennies mission. And they can, again, create all this threat zone. They can basically zone out the 3 pennies right from the beginning. So without further ado, when should you drop for first turn or not? Now, my first reason would be you've got a terrible terrain setup, i.e. no cover or annoying impassable that are going to screw you up. And in the background of each one of these, I've got images from my own game, so we can actually look at a real world example about when it is a good idea to drop for first or not to drop for first. So this one is one of my most recent games taken from my last tournament report where I played against Demonic Legions in the final game. And I actually got to pick table sides here, which I thought was far better than picking sides. Like this side where the demon army is has 2 impassable. It's just completely hemmed in. And my opponent chose to drop for first turn, which I think was probably a good idea, because imagine if I'd got the first turn here as well. All of my stuff would be basically on the halfway line, and he would be completely bottlenecked in here. He'd never be able to move out. So conversely, I didn't really want to deploy for the first turn myself without seeing where his stuff was, because with these 2 impassable and the hill, he's actually got a lot of space that he can take cover, which would and if he just goes back a little bit, my first magic and shooting phase is going to do almost nothing. So I was happy to get the side. I think he made the right decision to drop and go first, but at the same time, I would have been very nervous to drop and go first myself, especially because this is a markers mission. So I wanted the chance to be able to grab these markers right at the end. Second reason, if you don't move forwards, you'll never get a chance to. So we talked about this earlier about creating board space, and I think especially against aggressive lists, you want to sometimes be able to take the initiative and push against them. So yeah, even against aggressive armies, where you feel like you're going to be the defender, which is a common dynamic in almost any game. I think sometimes it's a better idea in fact, almost always, it's a better idea to try to push them a little bit and create some board space behind you. This lets you flee. So this is a picture from the same tournament that I just did the report of. And I did drop for first turn here. And I talked about this in the report about how important it was for me to get the first turn, because this is a super aggro, high elf cavalry and flying army that it would have just been all across the board. And like, look at this, my spearmen don't have enough distance to make a single flee move here. The same thing with my archers. I would have just been completely pressured too. So for me, the decision to drop for first here was not really even motivated by getting the first shooting phase in. It was all about creating some breathing room for my units. And if you go and look at the report, you'll actually see that I just kept this trend going where I was pushing and pushing against this army and ended up almost on the halfway line, and he never made it out. And I could do this because I had this wonderful safety net of space behind me that I could flee into if needed. So the third reason is your magic and shooting casualties would be unbearable if you didn't get the first turn. So here's this is the most obvious reason that I think people tend to drop for first. That they see the enemy has some significant ranged output, and they want to experience as little of that as possible. So what do? They drop their army and they start and they push to try to get into combat as quickly as possible. So this is the post turn one picture from another one of my games. It's my highborn elves against a fairly shooty Sylvanarf army. And I believe my opponent won the roll for sides here, and I decided just to go for it. And you can see the reason I decided to here was a little bit related to point number one, where I have very poor cover here. Even though I have a ruin on this side, it's really oddly positioned. Like if I were to stick my shooting units in here, he could just go on the other side of the board with me shooting almost nothing. This forest is basically useless for the same reason, because there's a freaking house in front of it. The only option I had was really to advance up in my first turn and take this wall, but then my own shooting units would be providing him cover to my bolt throwers here at the back. So, and then also I'd be very vulnerable to a hyper aggressive push from him because I'd be so close to his lines. So I didn't really like this option of going up here. That's why I decided to drop my army and go first and go up this side, because this is another situation where he's actually got the ability to fight me at range. A lot of the time you can create a spatial advantage because you have superior range shooting or superior maneuverability. Against Sylvan Elves, it's really difficult to do because they've got quick to fire and at least 5-inch move or a 10-inch move, and then 30-inch longbows. And they normally come in multiple units with high volume of shooting. It's really, really difficult to try to beat them in a shooting positional game. So I decided to go for it here, and it somehow worked out. I think my opponent did probably the only thing he could, which was not put stuff in front of my main army and go over here because he's got a wall for cover, he's got a field, he's got his free forest. But I still ended up going well in my favor because all of these are all his Way Watchers, Pathfinders out to the side. They just got obliterated eventually by my stuff, and I was able to swing around and without risk because I've got all of this board space. Now, if he was to go first, I think my deployment would. If he was able to drop and go first against me here, I think my deployment would be quite different. Certainly, all my units would not be out in the open here, and I would be playing a very reactionary game depending on where his units were placed. I doubt he would put his units in the same spot if he was trying to go first here. But yeah, I think obviously all my stuff is in the open, and if he was going first, he would just shoot the crap out of me and probably win the game. So I spoke to my good friend Arthur, another highborn elf / shooting avoidance expert from the forums. And he had one very quotable line on this subject, which was, generally speaking, dropping for first turn to rush an army that will shoot and blast you to pieces is only a good idea if there are no better alternatives. So Thomas is a master of deployment, particularly, and just really moving in clever way, placing his units and moving in clever ways that will mitigate the enemy's damage output. Recently saw a game of his in the WCC, where he had a very, very fragile Dread Elf army against a horrific standard kind of net list Empire of Sonstall gunline. And even with the Empire getting the first turn, Thomas was able to counter deploy effectively enough that he took only a handful of damage in the first turn and was then still able to successfully execute his rush. Now, another reason to take the first turn, and this is obviously very specific, is that you've got Wrath of God or Totemic Summon. These are spells that have a dependency, but it's simple, really. Like I was going to say it has a dependency on going first. It doesn't have a dependency on going first, but if the first turn, that means because the comet comes down in your opponent's turn, and the totem beast would be charging in your turn, it means that you've got 6 turns of commenting someone instead of 5. That's simple. So I've been playing the Sentinel with a Thaumaturgy in Demons a lot, and I do sometimes think against fairly static armies that I want the first turn purely to get 1 extra comment in. And I think this might be my last reason. I can't remember how many slides I put in this, but a big reason to deploy first, and for me this is the only reason, is when you already have enough information to formulate your entire game plan and can adapt to whatever they do. which is pretty wordy, but I think it's all encompassing as well. And again, a picture from that same event where I decided to drop for the first turn, and it was all purely motivated by this central unit of bruisers being deployed by my opponent to start. And because it was mission capture the flags, and my army is maneuverable enough, I decided just to dump everything. Didn't really care where his other stuff went because I can reposition and just kind of ad hoc my game plan to where his stuff is. And then I had a very, very clear shooting target right on the front line that telegraphed my game plan, which was just kill this and figure the rest out. So here's a bonus tip, addendum to my last video, which is take photos of all your games. You will be amazed. And if you can, write battle reports. Even if you just send it to a friend, you will get so much more mileage out of your gaming and be able to improve at a much more rapid pace. I've been struggling to get the volume of games that I did when I was a dashing young wargamer back in the day, when I was doing 300 plus games and 15 plus tournaments in a year. But so these days, what I've been focusing on instead is trying to get quality practice in rather than quantity. So for the last 3 or 4 years, I've been writing battle reports of almost every single one of my games, taking pictures. It's kind of difficult to remember in the beginning to be taking pictures and without losing focus of your tactics and what you're trying to do. But just start, even if you just get a deployment picture, you'll be able to recall almost all the details of the game after a little while, and then take some conclusions from there, analyze what you did wrong, and try not to blame the dice. You can almost always backtrace where things went wrong to a deployment phase or a movement phase. That's simple. So take pictures and look back. I've got years of photos of my games, some of which you'll see now. So here's a mirror match. It's a 3,000 point tournament. I think this might even be, it is the last edition of the book because he's still got a demon cannon. But this was a 3K mirror match where we were playing on the top table in the final round of a little event. And I had the courtesan, he had a cannon, and the all wrath army. And I decided, all right, he's got a cannon. I've got a big monster. This is his only way to kill this. I just want to minimize how many shots he gets on it and just go for it. You can see as well, I didn't really have a hill to work with to take cover. So for me, deploying the courtesan behind this impassable to hide in the first turn would just be ridiculous, because how can it ever come out? You end up paying so many inches to try to get back out from here. You might as well just start in the open. So you can see here I deployed to start and just rushed him, just with everything. And you can see that the thing here is I talked about in my last video where I'm threatening the shooting units. And he's basically now got a choice, which is you can take one shot and then you're going to die, or you can move to try to protect yourself and my courtesan is going to not be killed, and then you're going to have far, far bigger problems. So this game ended up in a total massacre of the enemy just because of this pure aggression. Again, I'm creating all this board space. I've got all the options to go backwards if I want, whereas he's just stuck and falling all over himself. Here's another mirror match, actually against the same opponent, but a couple of years later. And here we've got an army with a scourge and some high quality but low range shooting against an army with the sentinel, a big block of sirens, demonettes, and 3 units of fiends. Now his army is really, really quick, except for this block. But what he was concerned about was all of my high quality shooting and magic tearing chunks out of this guy. So he decided to drop for the first turn. And what that did, you can see how I was able to counter deploy with my whole army over here. I believe this was also capture the flags, by the way. So my plan here was to just target these crushers, these, what are they called? Brazen beasts. They were crushers at the time. Just target these guys, these imps. And you can see, even though he's spread out his imps over here, these guys over here, there's still a very clear bullseye for me to go after these 2 scoring units on this flank and just try to win the mission. And indeed, like his big guy deployed behind a building, but I think there's absolutely no reason for him to drop for first turn here and give up all of this information. Like this is one of his main units that never saw combat, this demonette block. It had to walk, I think, 4 turns to even get past this impassable. And then all my stuff was gone. I'd gone forward or gone back into the corner or just chaffed him. And so this was a completely wasted unit. The and then the Sentinel realized that it couldn't actually target any of my army with its own magic, so his own magic phase was just wasted by sitting here. So I think this was one of those situations where if his army's so quick, he can just go 6 inches backwards with everything. He's already out of range of all my shooting, even if I go on the max distance forward line, and he doesn't give up all this information to let me counter deploy. This is another game from the Masters, and here I'm actually using an Orcs and Goblins army in an army swap round, and this, as luck would have it, the army that I'd drawn belonged to my opponent while he'd gotten someone else's demon army. And he understood his own army's weaknesses extremely well. And the first thing he did, no, I haven't got a picture of that. The first thing he did was he dropped for the first turn and he pushed halfway across the board. And you can see how huge this army's footprint is. I was just tripping all over myself to try to get into the game. And he did really well. Again, it's a 3 markers mission, so he was just putting a lot of pressure on these markers, forcing some really hard decisions of how am I going to get there. And as it happened, I had to gamble and rely on blind luck to get out of trouble in this game because he knew the matchup so much better than I did. If the armies had been reversed, I think he would have absolutely crushed me. So I'll chalk this one up to blind improvisation and luck that I got away with this, but my opponent made a really good decision to drop and start here. And indeed, when I talked previously about spammy lists being uninteresting and not really good in a sense, here you can see, because I've only got like 3 unit types, I've got the Nashers, I've got Iron Orcs, and I've got Savage Orcs. It doesn't really matter. You can see my army's kind of symmetrical, right? It doesn't really matter where my stuff goes. I've got very limited threat profiles. So the whole game of engineer, scissors, paper, rock doesn't really work here because it's all kind of the same thing. So this would be one where dropping for first turn with this Orc army would actually make sense because I'm not trying to engineer any specific unit matchups. And I think this is the final example. This is another game with my demons, where I was playing against an Empire army, and my opponent here, obviously I've got the Scourge, and the Scourge doesn't want to get a cannonball to the face. Simple. So my choices here are either drop for first turn and try to get the Scourge into cover, or if he drops for first turn, try to deploy the Scourge in cover, and then somehow just hop from cover to cover. Now, this table is pretty open. If my opponent had dropped for first turn here and placed the cannon more or less where it is, you can see the only safe spot for the Scourge would have been kind of all the way here behind the hill, and that's a big detour. It's going to take him like 2 or 3 turns to get into the game, which is a long time for like an 800-point model to be doing nothing. So as it was, my point in my previous video, I said about deploying your most static elements last. This is a perfect case study of why you should do that. My opponent, as many opponents do, stated something like, well, I already know where my war machines are going to go, and deployed his cannon as the first placement here, which I actually had another Empire say the exact same thing and do against me 2 months later. But when I saw where this cannon was, I immediately know how many of my range units are going to be able to reach it and where its arcs of sight are. So my deployment of my Scourge here was able to get out of cannon line of sight in turn 1, and he has no net. So I just drop, as soon as he put this cannon down, I just dropped my army to start, because this is the only thing I cared about in deployment, was where this thing is, because it was the only thing controlling the Scourge's movement. So I think I didn't go into too many examples of why you should play second, but hopefully the overarching theory there is evident. And I guess you could almost make the deduction that if your reasoning doesn't match these points that I've just covered now, and you can't use any of these to justify your decision for dropping for first, maybe don't drop for first. Because I do think there is a lot of value in counter deploying and playing second. If you enjoyed the video, let me know, and we can find some similar topics to this to talk about in the future.